Hello and welcome to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and our policy forum on great power competition in the Middle East and how it is responding to the Iran war, the U.S. Israel operation against Iran. I'm Grant Rumley, the Meisel Family Senior Fellow here and Director of the Glazer Foundation Program on Great Power Competition in the Middle East. And I'm thrilled to be hosting this discussion here with some of our most esteemed experts on great power competition and the region. As we enter the third week of Operation Epic Fury, I think it's clear to everyone that the repercussions of this conflict are expanding far beyond the borders of the Middle East. We've seen it affect our allies and partners in Europe and the Indo-Pacific, as well as our rivals and adversaries in China and Russia. Here to help us unpack some of the implications for China, Russia, and our allies and partners in Europe and Asia are some of our really some of the leading experts on these issues at the Washington Institute and in town. To my left is Anna Borshchevskaya, our Harold Grinspoon Senior Fellow and the author of a recently released Washington Institute report co-authored with Matt Tavares on how Russia is navigating its foreign policy and approach to the Middle East in the middle of its operation against Ukraine. I'd encourage everyone to go to our website and read that as well. To her left is our newest SORA fellow, Henry Tugendhat, a specialist in China, an economist. He recently joined us, and I think this is his first policy forum, so we're thrilled to have Henry here. And then to his left is Souhire Medini, a visiting fellow in residence from the French Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs, who will have to answer for all things Europe and France during this panel. So what I thought we'd do is I'd start with some sort of basic general questions for our panelists here. We also have a Q&A function on our website. So if you would like to join in this discussion, please feel free to send your questions to either the Q&A function in the Zoom chat or email your questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. That's policyforum, all one word, at washingtoninstitute.org. So let's perhaps start with the biggest elephants in the room, Russia and China, and how they're navigating this. And I'll start with you, actually. Russia, pretty close partner with Iran, a pretty symbiotic relationship. We've seen them both help each other at different points of crisis over the past few years. In the broadest, sort of the broad level, how is Russia involved in this conflict right now?
Well, it's a pleasure to be with everyone here today. I'd like to start by looking at it from Russia's perspective. And the way to understand, to get to your question is really to look at how is Putin looking at this conflict. And from his perspective, fundamentally, nothing has changed in terms of his bigger goals. Putin's bigger goal is a fundamentally different world order. It's what he wanted when he invaded Ukraine. It is what he wants to see happen now. And what does that mean for the Middle East and how he's approaching this crisis? Well, what it means is there's nothing for him to fundamentally shift in terms of how he approaches this war. Putin is applying a very sophisticated approach to the Middle East, and it is one of restraint. It is one where there's really not that much for him to do. He can simply stand back and watch the chaos unfold, publicly criticize the United States, and privately help Iran. And that is exactly what we see unfolding today. And if you understand this bigger picture of what Putin wants to accomplish, it makes sense that we're seeing reports from the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal that Russia is providing Iran with intelligence, satellite imagery, and other information. There was no reason for Putin to get into a direct military clash with the United States. That is a fight he will lose. It would be foolish for him to do that. So instead, he is applying a much more sophisticated approach, and that is one of public restraint and privately helping Iran.
Same question over to you then. How would you characterize China's involvement in this conflict?
Sure. And similarly, let me start by saying thank you for having me. It's great to be here. And there are a lot of similarities with what Anna described insofar as this is obviously not a war that China wants to allow itself to get dragged into. This is not the fight that it would want to pick with the US. And so certainly its most clear and present involvement in this war to date has been the diplomatic angle in which it has been calling out the belligerents, US and Israel, for launching these attacks. But then it's placed in a slightly more awkward position in how Iran's responded, and in terms of particularly of how Iran has been attacking sites across the Gulf region, which involves many of China's far deeper and more significant relationships, such as the Saudi Arabians and the UAE. That said, China is still looking to sell weapons to Iran, materials that it can afford to part with. It also has no incentive to stop supporting Iran in these capacities in light of US weapon sales to Taiwan. I mean, it's just not, it's not going to consider that a serious proposition at this moment. I'd say the main difference, though, with Russia and China is of course, the fact that China is Iran's main economic lifeline right now, in that Iran primarily makes money off selling its oil, and it primarily makes that money off selling oil to China. Whereas, of course, Iran is much more of a competitor when it comes to oil sales. So I'd say overall, it is obviously trying to keep a low profile when it comes to how this conflict is going to be resolved at present. It's watching, it's waiting for diplomatic opportunities. But I'm sure that it would be playing a role in private back channels, conversations that it has with Gulf partners, with Iran. And it's dispatched its Middle East envoy to the region, Jaijun, recently to facilitate those conversations. So bit of a mixed bag, but certainly perhaps in some respects more involved by virtue of its economic lifeline to Iran.
Terrific. Thanks, Henry. Souhire, how would you characterize, I mean, how has Europe really navigated the last 3 weeks here? I think it's safe to say there's been a bit of turbulence in terms of what the US wants and expects. How do you see the varying schools of thought within Europe approaching this situation?
Thank you, Grant. A pleasure to be part of this panel today. So I would say European countries are facing the challenges they were trying to avoid when pushing for a renewal of negotiations. First, one French soldier was killed in the context of this war. Others were wounded in northern Iraq. French soldiers were not there for this war, but they were providing counterterrorism training in the region as part of the ISIS, the coalition to fight the Islamic State. Second, a country, a European Union member state, Cyprus, was struck by Iranian-made drones and missiles, and so that directly prompted several EU countries to send military assets in Eastern Mediterranean to protect one member state. We had several of them: the UK, Germany, Greece, even Spain, and Italy, France. And so in a way, they had to be involved in this war. They did not decide to launch. And we also have some EU countries who decided to send assets in the Middle East to help protect their allies. Several Europeans have defense agreements, military cooperation with countries in the Gulf, for example, with the Emirates, who asked for help to defend themselves. So this deployment happened in this context. And domestically, on the energy front, European citizens are feeling the immediate consequence of the surge in prices. And in a way, this war was a stark reminder that even if Europe is more resilient than in 2022 after the energy crisis prompted by Russia's war in Ukraine. It's still too reliant on fossil fuels, so we should expect a new rush towards homegrown energy sources for Europeans, especially nuclear, which is something rather new. And all these different elements that pushed the European countries to be involved created a pressure to elaborate on their position, and specifically to know that if sending such assets meant they were joining this war, which is a label they refuse. So we've seen that the way the UK tried to navigate this, first refusing to let the US use UK bases, but then the UK announced that the US would be able to use them as long as it is for specific and limited defensive purpose, including to destroy Iranians' missiles at source, which shows how difficult it is to define the difference between defensive and offensive, because destroy at source means to go inside Iran. Other governments refused, as the Spanish government, who refused to let US forces use the joint military bases they have, which prompted US President Donald Trump to criticize heavily Spain. And I would say the last way in which Europe is facing this war is the risk for what is an existential war for Europeans, which is the war efforts in Ukraine. On this specific point, the decision, the US administration decision to issue sanctions waivers to Russia in a move to curb oil prices has left several European countries quite frustrated, because, as Anna underlined before, we know that Russia is helping Iran in this war effort.
Thank you. I want to come back at some point in this discussion to how this war is affecting Ukraine and the situation on the ground there, and the broader security picture in Europe. But going back to this conflict in particular, I want to look at Russia and China, and basically at sort of a broad level. I think the conventional wisdom is that both China and Russia can benefit in some ways from this conflict, or perhaps at least sort of survive in the status quo, but that there are some longer term implications that may negatively impact their interests as well. And so perhaps let's look at the Russia side of the equation first. Anna, to your mind, is this war generally on the good side of the ledger for Russia right now? Is it trending positively? Is it sort of a short-term gain, but perhaps long-term risk? How would you characterize Moscow's view of the conflict?
I think this war is certainly a short-term gain for Moscow, potentially a long-term risk, but long-term is a very vague proposition from the Kremlin's perspective. When you think about what's happening now, there are a number of benefits here for Putin. First, the immediate spike in oil prices, along with the temporary lift on sanctions that Souhire has mentioned, which has really given an important injection of resources into Putin's war machine in Ukraine at a time when Russia was really floundering on the battlefield. That's one. Second, this discord, and maybe we can get into this later, this discord between the United States and NATO is very much to Putin's advantage, because he wants to see the West divided. From this fundamental bigger goal objective that Putin has, does this war shift anything in terms of what he wants to accomplish in terms of his bigger goals? No, it doesn't, because he wants to see a world order where the United States has less power on the international scene, and the United States is still his chief adversary. It's not a direct war, but it's a, you can call it a Cold War 2.0, if you will. It's what Putin is trying to do is play out the Cold War with an alternate ending, and this unfolding chaos presents a lot of opportunities for Russia to play up to its advantages. There are certainly risks, and maybe we can get into that later in the conversation. But I think from his perspective, look at how Putin has been very careful in not criticizing Israel. He was criticizing only the United States. And what does that tell us about his objectives, about his interests? It's all about the United States. There is a way that this crisis can potentially harm his interests, but so far, again, this is such a long-term vague proposition that I don't see Putin panicking.
Henry, perhaps you could talk a little bit on the China view of the situation. I mean, I think it's fair to say that Iran relies on China economically, but China doesn't necessarily rely on Iran. In their view, though, I think any turbulence in a crucial waterway, a crucial market for their own commercial interests is still perhaps a net negative in the long term. I mean, it's a complicated economic picture. How would you characterize China's view of the war?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've summed it up very nicely. It's I think there are some short-term gains that people have pointed to that similar to what Anna was laying out, insofar as it's created a diversion for US military assets and US attention away from the East Pacific. It is an opportunity to see how the US launches such an attack from a carrier strike group at sea. So there are some obvious short-term opportunities there. You could even throw in a longer-term small opportunity is at the end of this war, someone's going to need to rebuild Iran, and China's construction companies are going to be well placed to do so. But that said, I mean, the list of advantages is quite small and quite limited. I think the downsides are perhaps more serious for China. Certainly, it does not like the disruption in the region. I mean, China's greatest economic interest in the region is stability. This is a massive problem for not just Chinese imports of energy supplies, but also for Chinese exports of EVs and green tech and any number of shipments that are going in and out of the Gulf every day to bring high-tech goods and even low-tech goods from China to the region. It's also a disruption to those construction projects that are going on across the region for buildings and railways and you name it. I would say, though, more ominously for China is what happens if this war continues for 2 to 3 months from now. China's proven itself to be incredibly resilient as far as energy security is concerned. It has been planning for a scenario just like this for a good 20 years. It really started this planning in 2002, ironically, the year before the Second Gulf War. But obviously it ramped up planning around energy security thereafter. And I think what this is proving right now is that China has done a very good job of preparing for a scenario just like this domestically. But what it cannot control is the fallout from this war over the rest of the world. And just to pick one example, Europe represents the largest export market for China, some 15% of its exports. And Europe is also very vulnerable to energy price shocks. And so as the price of energy goes up in Europe, this could have a real effect on Europe's capacity to absorb and demand Chinese exports. And that's the kind of risk that China's going to be really worried about, because this is an economy that is still coming out of shaky territory from the COVID-19 crises. Its GDP growth has been slowing for several years, and it is overwhelmingly dependent on export markets to drive domestic growth. And if domestic growth, if exports take a hit, then that is going to have an effect on wages, and an effect on wages is going to have an effect on domestic demand, and it's a vicious spiral from there. So I think it's China's fine for now, probably fine for a few more weeks, but I think like much of the rest of the world, it starts to get very stressed very quickly, 2 to 3 months from here.
Amazing. Thank you, Henry. Souhire, I think we all saw Sunday the president call on several countries, France, China, others to join a new coalition of the willing, perhaps, to help reopen and secure the Strait of Hormuz. I think we've seen in the days since some frustration from the president towards what I would characterize as a less than enthusiastic response to countries around the world to being asked to support this mission. And then also, a pretty similar variation of a theme here, which is a critique towards NATO and what the president characterizes as a one-way street. From NATO and European perspective, I mean, I guess my question for you is twofold. What do you think the sort of likeliest reaction is in terms of this call to arms, this call to support this mission? And then more broadly, perhaps, what do you think this will mean for NATO proceeding in the second Trump administration? Is this sort of at this point, baked into the calculation? It's business as usual. Every once in a while, we'll experience these moments of turbulence, or is there a fear, perhaps, that this could be a turning point?
Thank you, Grant. So the perception in Europe and NATO is not only European countries are part of NATO. There is also Turkey. I think it's worth mentioning here. So the European perspective is first that NATO is first and foremost a defensive alliance, and that its members are bound by a shared commitment to safeguard the freedom and security of all allies. And that at the heart of the famous Article 5 is the idea that each country should commit to defend each other, but not necessarily joining each other in a war effort. And actually, this reminds me of the discussions triggered by Russia on NATO, saying that having all these neighboring countries part of NATO was threatening Russia. And the European answer, which was basically saying, as long as you do not plan to invade these neighboring countries, you should not see NATO as a threat, because these countries are part of NATO only to defend themselves if need be. So this is the first point. But that being said, there is a history of NATO engaging in combat operations, including in the Middle East and North Africa. It was the case in Libya. More recently, the ISIS formally joined the US-led coalition. But what is interesting to see is under which circumstances this took place. As you said, coalition of the willing. So these countries were willing to take part. Coordination happened, planification between the allies. And second, it was based on a UN Security Council resolution. So it had for Europeans a solid legal basis. This did not happen for this war, because for Europeans, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz cannot be just separated from the ongoing war effort, and that it should be like one military campaign, and they are not part of this campaign. And second thing, to give a specific example, the fact that during a press conference, Secretary of War labeled rules of engagement as stupid for Europeans, and going back to the idea of respecting an international framework, this is a red flag, because for Europeans, they consider they have legal obligations. So to have this idea that they will be part of a campaign not respecting certain rules and international law is difficult. But on the Strait of Hormuz, I think it's worth noting that European countries did not close the door, but instead they said that they would be willing to do this provided we're not in such a war situation, because as I said, it would mean being part of this of this campaign. But it's true that what Europeans do not want here is clear, but their ability to offer and implement something substantial is not obvious at this stage. We had talks even before actually Donald Trump asking NATO countries to do something. We had statements, official statements from Europeans for the creation of a defensive mission operating in the Strait of Hormuz. But it's true that so far these statements have been a bit hazy, and we'll see afterwards if they would be able to offer something more substantial. On the future of NATO, I think this is too early to give an answer, but surely this is a big risk for European countries. They probably took it into account, and they probably see as positive the proposal by Ukrainian leader Zelensky that Ukraine was ready to help Gulf states protect themselves against the drones, highlighting the cooperation and how both Russia and Iran were helping themselves when it comes to manufacturing cheap drones to overwhelm the allies' ability to protect themselves. So I think a lot will depend also on this possibility.
Terrific. Thank you, Souhire. I think now we'll open it up for questions from the audience here, and we have a number already here, mostly circulating around Taiwan and Ukraine, and really what this current operation and current war in Iran means for Ukraine and Taiwan and the U.S. China-Russia competition there. So, perhaps since we talked about Ukraine a little bit earlier, we'll start there, and I guess I'll start with Anna. I mean, if you're making I don't, you never want to make predictions, but if you're making some predictions in terms of what the near-term repercussions are of this conflict, we've seen Ukrainians providing counter UAV technology. Certainly, I think Zelensky has leaned quite forward in providing support to some of the Arab Gulf states. I think they probably have some resources that they can share in return for that. So it would seem that Ukraine would stand to benefit in some way, shape, or form from leaning forward in its support. Russia also perhaps in a different position. How do you see it really affecting the battlefield and perhaps the rest of this year in terms of Ukraine?
Well, I see a couple of immediate effects on the battlefield. One is, again, because Russia has this fresh influx of cash to devote to the war, how is Russia going to reconstitute its forces? But two, Zelensky, as you said, Grant, wasted no time in offering help to the Gulf states. And I think that shows how well the Ukrainians have adapted to this war, how quickly they were able to move, and what a difficult war this is going to be to resolve, because you have two sides that are, for different reasons, with different goals in mind, are committed to fighting Russia in its war of aggression, and Ukraine is fighting to survive, to protect itself in a very difficult, in incredibly difficult circumstances that Zelensky is trying to navigate. So I think from our perspective, it would be important for us to recognize the significance of this moment when Zelensky offered this help to the Gulf states. And it shows what an incredible asset Ukraine really is to the West. And in terms of how this war is going to unfold, one immediate outcome we see is that the West is distracted from Ukraine because everybody's focusing on Iran, as we've discussed here before. So this raises the question of how big a priority is Ukraine going to be for the West. Certainly, it is going to be a priority for Vladimir Putin. That we can count on. And to that end, also, if I may, I want to go back to your earlier question, Grant, and highlight. I feel I didn't answer your question as well as I could have, perhaps, when you were talking about repercussions for Russia for this war in Iran. Russia's worst case scenario would be if Iran were to turn pro-Western, if there was a pro-Western regime emerging in Tehran. At this stage, that does not appear to be likely. And that is probably why we're not seeing Putin panicking. It does not mean he's not paying attention. But let me also add that even if there was a pro-Western regime in Tehran, that would not be the end of Russia's strategy towards the Middle East. Russia would find a way to work with that regime. What I would also add is, as Russia is watching the U.S. and Israeli military campaign, we can count on the fact that Russia is paying very close attention because Russia watches and learns from our military campaigns. And the fact that we were able to execute such a flawless campaign that degrades Iran's ability to project power, its naval forces, that is not something that's lost on the Kremlin. It's simply a matter of how does that fit into Russia's bigger goals. So that's not a net benefit to Russia to see that the United States military was able to accomplish that.
Souhire, I wonder if I could just ask you the same question, but from sort of the European perspective. How would you characterize the European view of the repercussions of the war in Iran on the battlefield in Ukraine?
I'd like first to take what Anna said about what would be a worst case scenario for Europeans, because this is very different, obviously, from Russia's. And it highlights the dilemma Europeans are facing right now. For Europeans, the worst case scenario would be a civil war, great instability in Iran that will lead for them a security threat, even terrorist attacks and flows of refugees. Actually, more or less what they had to face 10 years ago after the civil war in Syria. But also they are afraid that the scale will be like worse and the repercussion would be higher for them. And so that's why they're facing a dilemma, because the government, the regime in Iran, for them is a threat. And that's why we've seen several European countries quite supportive of this war, convinced that if this military campaign ends with ending the regime or threatening it, the security of Europe will be better off because of the links with the war in Ukraine. But this idea of maybe it will not be the end, and that the end could rather be big instability, is this what is what explain this European skepticism towards a war waged by their ally?
Could I pick up on that very quickly, actually? From the Russian perspective, as Russia is looking into this scenario, one thing you can count on Russia doing is weaponizing any migration crisis. And should there be such a crisis, you can count on Russian disinformation operations. You can count on Russia looking for other ways to exacerbate it. That may or may not happen. But from a Russian perspective, Putin needs to stay back, watch and pay attention, and see where he can step in, and you can expect him to act in that way.
Awesome. Thanks to you both. Henry, we've got another big elephant in the room here, and it's Taiwan. Several questions in the group chat. One, just first and foremost, would China see this current U.S. operation as a really good opportunity to try to retake Taiwan or take Taiwan by force? Another question, a great one from our friends out in California here, basically asking, how does China view the low level of support within the U.S. for this conflict as a determining factor in their own sort of long-term calculations vis-a-vis Taiwan? So I guess, to sort of break it down, is this a moment where China might take advantage in your view? No pressure. And if so, or if not, perhaps, how is it seen, really, I think, the U.S. going into a conflict with historically low levels of public support for a major military operation?
Thank you. Well, I feel like I'm certainly on safer ground going with the more conservative response than the completely wild out there response that this is going to lead to another conflict tomorrow. But certainly, I really genuinely would on the side of, I don't think that this is going to trigger a Chinese invasion of Taiwan within the coming days or weeks or near future, medium term, just on the basis that, for starters, we don't even know when this war in Iran is going to end. Trump started off by saying that this was going to be a 3 or 4 week campaign, maybe 4 or 5 weeks. We're almost there. We haven't even reached the end of those 4 or 5 weeks, assuming that that is still part of the possible outcomes of this timeline. And if anything, there is more reason to believe that Trump is getting concerned about the length of this operation than really deciding to enthusiastically continue this for months. So I think certainly from Beijing's perspective, it would be foolish to open a new front when, for all they know, this might be wrapping up shortly. Certainly, I think they would be interested in the polling about US appetite for this war. I think that likely translates to how this war has been communicated domestically and why the US should launch this war and get involved in this war. And they will be thinking about that in terms of, well, if we were to retake Taiwan, then what would the messaging look like around that? And how would the appetite for US people in the homelands be incentivized to support this or not? And I'm sure they're watching that closely. I don't want to overstate how much they care about that, but I'm sure it's a factor. That said, China would frame any such incursion on Taiwan very differently to what's going on here, right? They would say, this is an internal matter. This is not some foreign invasion. This is an unresolved dispute that has gone on since 1949 and obviously previously. And so this shouldn't even concern the United States. And so, in fact, if anything, US citizens should be even less concerned about Taiwan than they are about Iran, as it were. Taiwan is no existential threat to the US in the way that the US may perceive Iran as an existential threat to its domestic interests or even its hegemony. That said, I think there is also an opportunity here for China to learn how Taiwan is stressed in a scenario like this, when it's cut off from its energy supplies, when it's cut off from petrochemical inputs. I mean, one of Taiwan's major industries is plastics. It is, of course, also the homeland of the greatest semiconductor manufacturing operations. And so, how is it surviving in this moment of stress? So it's definitely a learning opportunity, if nothing else. And then, sorry, just last point on are we going to see China go to war? I think there is also the very important caveat that, of course, China took everyone by surprise in January, or rather, Xi Jinping took everyone by surprise in January, by sacking the last sort of 2 senior leaders of their Central Military Commission. There is an expectation that they're going to be replaced, or that Xi is going to be replacing the Central Military Commission in the coming months, over the next year, basically. China is not in the right place right now, either domestically or even when looking to the international realm to really open up a new front, I would wager.
Awesome. Thank you, Henry. A question here for all of us, but I'm actually going to invoke moderator privilege here and take a first swing at it. But it's the question is basically, what sort of military takeaways do we think Europe, China, Russia are taking away from this current U.S. military operation? And I would just argue, I think there's several, and it's sort of ironic in a way that the Middle East is often home to a lot of lessons learned for non-U.S. Actors. The first Gulf War was such really a pivotal moment for Chinese military modernization. To watch a largely Soviet-equipped military, the way the Chinese military was Soviet-equipped at that point in time, get decimated by the U.S. military so handily and so quickly, really raised a lot of alarm bells within Beijing and really sort of spurred on a military modernization and a self-sufficiency drive within the PLA that we see bear fruit today. I think if you are watching the U.S. prosecute this campaign right now, there's probably a number of indicators that may be giving you pause. One, I think in particular, is the use of advanced technologies and AI in this conflict. The U.S. is simply going after targets much faster than we have in the past. We are doing assessment of efficacy in going after these targets faster. We're disseminating information quicker. The sort of if you look at the range of the intelligence to targeting cycle, it's just operating at a speed that we haven't used before, and it's perhaps not draining as much resources as it has in the past. That's leading, in my opinion, to perhaps some shortfalls and some accidents and some regrettable incidents as well. But the overall speed and scale of it, I think, is really unprecedented in modern warfare, and something that I think both China and Russia will look at and see as perhaps a U.S. advantage. The other sort of takeaway is the level of integration the U.S. can do with another partner ally military. I think obviously the U.S. Israel relationship is unique. I think both Russia and China see it as unique. But integrating Israel into CENTCOM in 2020 or 2021, going through several sort of operational exercises or real life scenarios in 2024 and then 2025 in the defense of Israel and the exchanges they had with Iran. And now this sort of our fourth joint operation together has really shown a division of labor at multiple levels and multiple domains that really is sort of unique to the U.S. way of war and demonstrates how the U.S. can work together with other partners. I think if you're China in particular, you're looking at other U.S. treaty allies in your theater, Japan, Philippines, and you're thinking to yourself, well, I've seen them expand cooperation with the Philippines, 4 new bases. I've seen them sort of the U.S. reshape and reform its command structure within its forces in Japan to allow for hopefully more seamless integration there. Perhaps this is something that can be replicated in defense of Taiwan. On the other hand, I do think if you're Russia and China and you're watching this conflict, you're also probably seeing some signs that perhaps I wouldn't say embolden you or give you hope, but are room for optimism. One is simply, I think that U.S. wartime goals in the second Trump administration are malleable, that they can be flexible, they can be pressed, and they can be changed. This conflict started with a range of military goals in mind, but has dwindled or vacillated between them at varying points in times during this conflict. In large part, that's been a result of economic pressure. And so I think if you're sitting there and you're Russia and you're China, you're thinking, okay, the Iranians are clearly not winning this campaign by any measure of modern warfare. The U.S. is being incredibly effective, and yet the Iranians are still able, through merit of being able to launch Shaheeds at energy infrastructure, close the Strait of Hormuz, exact an economic price, and ultimately change some of the U.S. goals in the middle of an operation. The other perhaps positive takeaway you would have as Russia or China is that to this day, the U.S. defense industrial base is not on a wartime footing. It is simply not producing the type of munitions, the sort of high demand, low density assets that they need for a modern conflict at a scale with which would really, I think, give you pause. And I think they've watched this debate, this very public debate in the run up to the conflict and during the conflict over supplies of advanced munitions, of PGMs, of interceptors, of all these sort of incredibly sophisticated assets. And they've concluded, yes, this is putting a strain on the U.S. military, and it perhaps has repercussions for our own contests and challenges in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe too. those are perhaps my takeaways, or what I think my takeaways would be if I was sitting in Moscow or Beijing. But perhaps I'd open it up here if anyone else wanted to offer any other perhaps hypotheses of what our competitors and our allies are taking away from this situation. Anna?
Yeah, a few thoughts, and I want to react to what you said, Grant. I think it's really important that you mentioned the Gulf War, because from the Russian perspective, they've studied all of our key military campaigns, especially starting with the Gulf War, the war in Iraq, and I think this will be another campaign that will be at the top of the campaigns that they study and extract certain key lessons from that. And you've outlined a number of them already. One, I think, is that again, watching the flawless execution of this campaign would reiterate to Moscow that the United States military is not something they want to go up against. And again, from that perspective, the execution of this campaign in and of itself fundamentally doesn't shift Moscow's goals. It only reiterates that they would need to look for other ways to complicate life for us, if you will, and that rather than a direct confrontation, you can expect indirect support for proxies or other ways to force us to expend our weaponry, force us to overexpend on other fields. And what does that tell us about Russia is that first, this is an adversary, again, that is playing the long game, that is studying us very carefully and extracting key lessons for itself on how to do better. It simply tells us that we're on different timelines. If we look at our elections, we're looking at November, we're operating in these very short timelines. Putin doesn't need to worry about that. When he talked about Ukraine several years ago, when he gave one of his public addresses to the Russian public, he actually invoked Russia's 21-year war with Sweden. So these are the time horizons that Russia is looking at. And so we're engaged in an adversarial contest where there's a mismatch of strategies and expectations. Again, I want to reiterate the flawlessness with which we executed that campaign and with which we're able to degrade Iran's ability to project power is a big takeaway for Russia. It's simply not a fundamental game changer.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sorry, I really like the points you laid out, and actually, I think the point that struck me most was how you were really identifying the significance of U.S. allies and partners in the region, and I think that is fundamentally the biggest difference with China, right? That China doesn't do alliances by principle, and this has been part of China's foreign policy since the 1980s. And so in many ways, its reaction to Iran, which is largely that of thoughts and prayers with some private sales on the side, is arguably what its default position was going to be, no matter the circumstances. And so I think in terms of learning opportunities from this, China is going to be interested in how the US has leveraged allies and partners in this war. So how the US has cooperated with Israel in the strikes. That's going to be of great interest to China, but also how the US has leveraged bases in the region. China is going to be thinking about this in terms of the bases that the US has established in the Philippines, obviously the long strategic partnerships that it's had with Japan and South Korea. And so I think that is going to be front and center for how China thinks about this and learns from this. But I don't know that it will necessarily change that calculation of its own allies anytime soon. I mean, that position on alliances ultimately depends on trust. And I don't know that China yet trusts some of its deepest partnerships like Russia to the extent that it would form a military alliance in the US conventional sense. I mean, even Iran, interestingly, never even made it to the highest level of partnership that China reserves for its greatest friends, so Pakistan, Belarus, I think Venezuela and Ethiopia were on that too. Iran was one peg below. But more broadly, again, I think when it comes to how will China learn from this militarily, China's conception of national security is also slightly different. And I think it's very illuminating that, Li Qiang in his remarks, the Chinese premier at the opening of the National People's Congress at the beginning of March was again really hammering the importance of technological self-sufficiency. And self-sufficiency is really the bedrock of Chinese national security, whether it's technology, whether it's energy security, whether it's food security. China has been striving for this, this nirvana of complete sort of self-sufficient autarky to defend its national interests, effectively ever since its creation. And so you might think that the real lesson to learn from this conflict is that Iran has somehow found itself in this war with very few friends and allies to turn to, and even its greatest friends are giving it very little in support. And of course, China is a much more powerful and successful country than Iran. But you might think that this is a scenario in which it might learn that, friends and allies are important in times of stress.
From a European perspective, I would say it's not so much about a military takeaway, but rather a lesson from this war and convincing European countries that they are on the right path with the idea of building strategic autonomy. It's been years now that this topic has been raised. And this war shows that even when European allies share the perception of Iran as a threat, they do not share the way this threat is handled. And so they need to build this strategic autonomy to be able to justify and implement their decisions. So a unified European defense is not yet a tangible reality. It's still a prospect for Europeans, but I guess that this war will convince them that they have to double down on building this.
Awesome, thank you. Well, we have a few minutes left here, and really, I think a great question here on flexibility in foreign policy approach. So the past year has seen a new Syrian government emerge, perhaps a setback for Russia and perhaps to a lesser extent China. Turmoil in the region. This current operation in Iran can end in a number of different ways. It could theoretically end with a new regime in Tehran as well. I guess what I look at when I look at Russian and Chinese foreign policy, I see a lot of flexibility inherently, an ability to sort of navigate and make deals with whoever emerges. Perhaps it's a flexibility that we don't particularly enjoy in the U.S. or in Europe. When you look at it, what's your view of how Russia sees China, the Europeans, when they think about potentially another regime being unsettled in the region after you can look back the past 10, 15 years, the Arab Spring, the varying unseatings of number of governments. How does your sort of country, your theater, navigate that type of turbulence?
Well, I agree with you, Grant, from as far as Russia is concerned. Russia's approach has been fundamentally flexible, and that's why in the beginning I started out emphasizing that Russia is pursuing a rather sophisticated approach, and right now it is one of restraint all across the region. It is that flexibility that allowed Russia to quickly make a deal with the new regime in Damascus. And that is why, even though this current operation in Iran does present a number of challenges for Russia, you don't see Putin panicking, because even if the worst case scenario unfolds, and that is a pro-Western regime emerging in Tehran, we can reasonably expect that Russia will find a way to work with that regime, because Iran is too big a country for Russia to ignore, and vice versa. This is not to say that this approach does not have its drawbacks, but it is that fundamental sophistication and very long-term thinking that Putin has applied to the region is the reason why, again, you don't see him panicking, why he can afford to take a step back in this current crisis. He can capitalize on this chaos and look for ways to how he can achieve advantages on the battlefield and elsewhere with the war in Ukraine. But remember that, again, for Russia, this is a fundamentally global battle that Russia is fighting. And strategies may change, but the fundamental goals do not.
Yeah, thank you. Really great question with respect to China, because China is by far I would say one of the most flexible countries out there on the international scene. I mean, it has proven itself to be unbelievably pragmatic when regimes that it may have supported have fallen, like Omar al-Bashir in Sudan or Mugabe in Zimbabwe. It's very quick to switch to the next leader and develop a meaningful, substantive relationship on trade and shared interests. And certainly it can do the same in Iran, right? It has long been a relationship of convenience. It really honestly wishes that this war had never happened. I believe that its criticisms of the US and Israel are absolutely sincere. But if push comes to shove, if domestic events take over, I mean, although they obviously seem very unlikely right now, but let's say hypothetically, protests rise up and overthrow the regime in the next week, then I think China would be more than capable of developing a meaningful relationship with the next regime, whoever takes place. But this also goes to the broader point, which is that I think this diplomatic flexibility is also one of China's great strengths right now. And it's something that it has been building up for the last 5 to 10 years through all of these initiatives, like the Global Security Initiative, the Global Governance Initiative, the Global Civilizational Initiative, and there are a bunch more that I can't remember off the top of my head, but all of this alphabet soup of global initiatives that China has launched are really a way of creating platforms through which it can find common ground with basically anyone in the world. And right now that might be, if an off-ramp is to be found in this Iran war, and if China is able to play a mediating role, it might look for ways to use these initiatives to present itself as a serious and stable diplomatic voice in this time. And it may look to use the ones that adhere most to other countries and regions that might have shared interests, like Europe, like Africa, like the rest of the Gulf countries.
I think for Europeans, on one hand, what happened in Syria last year convinced them that a principled foreign policy makes sense, because the pressure was huge to normalize with Bashar al-Assad, something they refused to do. And finally, their gut, which was that this regime cannot hold power for decades because it's so weak, was kind of right. But at the same time, the new leader was not their number one choice. And yet they showed pragmatism. And I think the difference here, and which maybe shows greater convergence between Europeans and Arab countries, is this idea of supporting leaders who will not be a source of chaos and disorder, and to show this relative pragmatism as long as it is a way to bolster the regional stability and thus the stability of Europe.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Well, I want to say thank you to my amazing colleagues, Souhire Medini, Henry Tugendhat, and Anna Borshchevskaya for sharing their incredible insights and expertise. This has been a Washington Institute Policy Forum on great power competition in the Middle East and how the current Iran war is shaping repercussions beyond its borders. For more Washington Institute analysis, please visit our website, washingtoninstitute.org. And thank you for tuning in.